If you look at a $1 bill today, you will see the words Federal Reserve Note. You will see the green ink in the face of George Washington. But what you are actually looking at is a piece of paper that holds a secret power over every human being on this planet. Most people believe that the US dollar is backed by gold or by the strength of the American economy. They think it is the world reserve currency simply because America is powerful. But that is a lie. The real reason your money has value is not because of a gold vault in Fort Knox. It is because of a secret deal made in a desert over 50 years ago. It is a deal that was signed in blood and oil. It is a deal that effectively rigged the global financial system and forced every nation on earth to bow to the American central bank. This is the story of the petrodollar. It is the story of how the United States was facing total economic collapse, and how one man made a secret trip to Saudi Arabia to save the empire. To understand this, we have to go back to the early 1970s. The world was changing. For decades after the Second World War, the global financial system was governed by the Bretton Woods Agreement. This meant that the US dollar was the only currency in the world backed by physical gold. If a country had dollars, they could take them to the US Treasury and exchange them for actual bars of gold. This made the dollar as good as gold. But by 1971, the system was breaking. The United States was spending billions of dollars on the Vietnam War and massive social programs. They were printing more money than they had gold to back it up. Other countries like France and Germany realized this. They started sending their dollars back to Washington and demanding their gold. The U.S. gold reserves were disappearing at an alarming rate. President Richard Nixon was trapped. On August 15, 1971, he went on national television and shocked the world. He announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency. It was backed by nothing but a promise. The results were immediate and terrifying. Inflation exploded. The value of the dollar plummeted. The American economy was spiraling toward a Great Depression. If the dollar died, the American empire died with it. The government needed a new way to make the world want the dollar. They needed to tie the dollar to something that every single person on earth needed. They needed something more important than gold. They found it in black gold. Oil. In 1973, the world was hit by the first major oil crisis. The Arab nations, led by Saudi Arabia, had cut off oil exports to the West to protest support for Israel. Gas prices quadrupled. People were lining up for miles just to put fuel in their cars. The Western world was paralyzed. It was in this moment of chaos that Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, saw a gap. He realized that if the U.S. could control the flow of oil money, they could control the world. In 1974, Henry Kissinger and his team made a secret journey to Riyadh. They met with the House of Saud, the royal family that ruled Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia was a developing nation with massive oil reserves, but they were surrounded by enemies and lived in a dangerous neighborhood. They were terrified of the Soviet Union, and they were terrified of internal revolutions. Kissinger offered them a deal that they could not refuse. He told the Saudi king that the United States would provide absolute military protection to the House of Saud. The U.S. would sell them the most advanced weapons in the world. They would train their army. They would guarantee that as long as the United States existed, the House of Saud would remain in power. It was a promise of eternal security, but the price was steep. In exchange for this protection, Saudi Arabia had to agree to two things. First, they had to agree to price all of their oil exports in US dollars only. They could not accept British pounds or French francs or Japanese yen. If you wanted to buy Saudi oil, you had to have US dollars. Second, Saudi Arabia had to take their massive surplus of oil profits and invest them back into the United States. They would buy US Treasury bonds, which effectively meant they were lending their oil money back to the US government to fund the American debt. By 1975, every other nation in the OPEC cartel followed Saudi Arabia's lead. This was the birth of the petrodollar. It was a masterstroke of economic warfare. Kissinger had successfully replaced gold with oil. Think about the implications of this. Every country in the world needs oil to run their factories and their cars and their military. Because oil was now only sold in dollars, every country was forced to build up massive reserves of US currency. If Japan wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they had to first sell their own products to get dollars. This created a permanent artificial demand for the US dollar. It didn't matter how much money the US printed. As long as the world needed oil, the world needed dollars. This allowed the United States to run massive deficits and print trillions of dollars without causing hyperinflation at home. Effectively, the United States was exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. Every time the Federal Reserve printed money, they were taxing every human being on Earth who used dollars to buy energy. This deal turned the US dollar into a weapon. It meant that the United States could sanction any country it didn't like by simply cutting them off from the dollar system. If a country could not access dollars, they could not buy oil. If they could not buy oil, their economy would die. This gave Washington the power to decide which nations would thrive and which would starve. It was a silent, invisible form of colonization. The world was no longer under the rule of the British Empire or the Roman Empire. It was under the rule of the dollar. But this power came at a massive cost to the rest of the planet. While the American middle class enjoyed cheap goods and a booming stock market funded by cheap debt, the developing world was crushed. Countries were forced to borrow dollars from the IMF and the World Bank to pay for their energy needs. When the value of the dollar went up, their debts became unpayable. The secret deal in the desert didn't just save America, it created a system of global debt slavery that continues to this day. For 50 years, this system remained unchallenged. It was the foundation of the American century. It funded the most powerful military in human history. It allowed the U.S. to consume far more than it produced. It was the ultimate free lunch. But secrets never stay secret forever, and every rigged system eventually faces a crisis. We are now entering a time where the petrodollar is under attack. The nations of the world are tired of being forced to use a currency that is used as a weapon against them. The alliance between Washington and Riyadh is fraying. And as we move into the second part of this story, we will see how the very deal that saved the dollar in 1974 might be the thing that destroys it in the 21st century. The world is waking up to the reality of the paper empire, and the consequences of the secret Saudi deal are finally coming home to roost. The system created by Henry Kissinger was perfect for the 20th century. It turned the United States into a financial superpower that could never go bankrupt because it could always print the currency the world was forced to use. But the world of the 21st century is looking very different. The petrodollar system is beginning to crack, and the consequences of those cracks will be felt in every bank account and every grocery store in America. To understand why the secret deal is falling apart, we have to look at the shifting tides of global power. For 50 years, the bargain held. The U.S. provided the guns, and the Saudis provided the oil and the dollars. But the relationship between Washington and Riyadh has turned cold. The trust that was built in the 1970s is gone. The first major blow to the system came from within the United States itself. The rise of fracking and domestic oil production meant that the U.S. no longer relied on Saudi Arabia for its energy. America went from being the biggest customer of Saudi oil to being one of its biggest competitors. This changed the math of the secret deal. When the U.S. didn't need Saudi oil, it stopped being as concerned about Saudi security. The royal family in Riyadh began to feel neglected. They watched as the U.S. made deals with their rivals in Iran and criticized their internal politics. The House of Saud realized that the American umbrella of protection might not be permanent. They began to look for new friends. They began to look east toward China. China is now the biggest buyer of Saudi oil. It is the engine of the global economy. For years, the Chinese were forced to use dollars to buy their energy just like everyone else. But they are no longer willing to play that game. China wants to use its own currency, the yuan, to trade. For the last several years, there have been quiet and intense negotiations between China and Saudi Arabia. They are talking about the one thing that was forbidden in the 1974 deal. They are talking about selling oil in yuan. If Saudi Arabia starts accepting other currencies for oil, the petrodollar dies. The artificial demand for dollars will evaporate. If countries no longer need dollars to buy oil, they will start selling their U.S. Treasury bonds. They will dump their dollar reserves. A flood of trillions of dollars would come rushing back to the United States, causing the kind of hyperinflation that the secret deal was designed to prevent. This is why the wars in the Middle East have been so frequent and so brutal. It is not about spreading democracy. It is not about human rights. It is about protecting the petrodollar. Think back to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In the year 2000, Saddam announced that Iraq would no longer accept dollars for its oil. He wanted to be paid in euros. Just a few years later, the United States invaded Iraq and toppled his government. One of the first things the new Iraqi government did was switch oil sales back to dollars. Look at Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He was planning to create a gold-backed African currency to sell oil and bypass the dollar. He was killed and his plan was destroyed. Any leader who threatens the dominance of the dollar finds himself in the crosshairs of the American military. The secret deal is protected by the barrel of a gun, but you can only fight the tide of history for so long. Today we see the rise of the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are building an alternative financial system. They are tired of the dollar being used as a weapon of sanctions. When the U.S. froze Russia's dollar reserves after the invasion of Ukraine, it sent a shockwave through the world. Every country realized that if they didn't follow Washington's orders, their national savings could be wiped out in a second. This has accelerated the process of de-dollarization. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record levels. They are preparing for a world after the petrodollar. They are preparing for the end of the secret Saudi deal. If the petrodollar collapses, the American way of life changes overnight. The ability to run massive debts will vanish. The government will be forced to raise taxes or cut spending in a way that would cause total social chaos. The cost of everything we import, from electronics to clothes to food, will skyrocket because the dollar will lose its purchasing power. We have lived for 50 years in a bubble of artificial prosperity created by a secret agreement. Most Americans have no idea that their standard of living is tied to a deal made in a desert in 1974. They have no idea how fragile the system really is. We are seeing the Saudi royal family play a very dangerous game. They're moving closer to China and Russia. They are joining the BRICS organizations. They're signaling to the world that the age of American dominance is over. They know that the U.S. cannot afford to lose them. If the Saudis walk away from the dollar, the music stops. The House of Saud is using this leverage to demand even more from Washington, while at the same time preparing to leave the dollar behind. It is the ultimate betrayal of the Kissinger plan. The student has learned from the master. They are using the same cold, hard logic that Kissinger used in 1974. The secret deal that saved the dollar also ruined the world in many ways. It fueled a century of endless war. It created a global economy based on debt rather than production. It allowed a small group of bankers and politicians to control the fate of nations. But the wheel is turning. The era of the petrodollar is in its twilight. Whether the collapse happens slowly or all at once, the result will be the same. The power that was centralized in Washington will be redistributed. The world will move back toward a multipolar system where no single currency can be used as a weapon. This is the great transition of our time. It is the story that the news media refuses to cover in depth because it exposes the true nature of power. As you hold your money or check your bank account, remember that you are participating in a grand experiment. You're holding the paper remnants of a secret deal. The petrodollar was a bridge that allowed America to cross the 20th century without falling into the abyss, but the bridge is crumbling. The gold is gone, and soon the oil might be gone too. We are returning to a world where value must be earned and cannot be printed. The secret Saudi deal of 1974 was a masterpiece of diplomacy and a tragedy of economics. It gave us 50 years of kingly status, but it left us with a debt that can never be paid. The reckoning is coming, and the world that rises from the ashes of the dollar will look nothing like the one we know today. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.